The sound of the bell above the door jingled as an elderly man shuffled into the car dealership, his steps slow but determined. At first glance, he seemed like just another grandparent out for a leisurely stroll, maybe with a little extra time to kill. But this man wasn't just out for a walk. He was on a mission. The dealership was bustling with customers, young professionals browsing the latest models and eager salespeople looking to make a deal. The atmosphere was lively, the energy high, as the latest cars lined the floor like shiny jewels on display. The air was thick with the smell of new leather and fresh paint, a scent that screamed luxury, exclusivity, and a modern lifestyle. But to the employees, this man, gray hair, wrinkles, an old suit that had seen better days, wasn't anything special. They barely gave him a glance. He stood there for a few moments, patiently waiting, but no one approached him. The salespeople were too busy with the younger, more interesting customers, the ones who looked like they could make a quick purchase. The elderly man's request was simple. He wasn't looking for anything fancy, just to talk to someone about a new car. But that simple request was ignored, dismissed as though he were invisible. What happened next would leave the dealership stunned and change everything they thought they knew about power, money, and the things that truly matter in life. The following day, the elderly man returned, but this time, there was something different about him. No longer just a figure lost in the background, he walked through those same glass doors with confidence, with purpose. And as the staff looked up, they were caught off guard. They recognized him now, but it was too late. What they didn't know was that the elderly man had quietly been watching the dealership, listening to the conversations, observing the transactions. What they didn't know was that this wasn't a random visit. It was part of a much bigger plan. A plan that would shock the dealership, its owners, and even the entire car industry. As the dealership went about its daily routine, they didn't realize that they had just overlooked a person who would soon own more than they could ever dream of. The man who was once ignored, who had been treated as a nuisance, was now about to make a move so powerful that no one could have seen it coming. But how could one elderly man take over a multi-million-dollar business?
And why?
Stay tuned, because what comes next will leave you speechless. You won't believe how the story unfolds. The stakes are high, and the consequences even higher. The following day, as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light across the sleek, glass-paneled dealership, the staff was oblivious to the fact that everything was about to change. The salespeople were still busy with the day's customers, their attention fixed on the new arrivals, the ones who dressed in suits or carried themselves with that unmistakable air of someone ready to buy. The elderly man hadn't been on their minds until the sound of the doorbell jingled once again. This time, there was no hesitation, no slow shuffle. The elderly man walked in with a sense of purpose, his eyes sharp beneath his silver-rimmed glasses. He wasn't the same man from yesterday. Something had shifted in him overnight. The same store that had ignored him, treated him like he was just a relic of the past, was now about to meet the consequences of their oversight. The sales floor, filled with the chatter of negotiations and engines revving, paused for a split second when he entered. People stopped what they were doing, glancing over, sensing that something was different. The man had returned, but now, the room felt oddly quieter, as if everyone was waiting for something. The salespeople who had once looked past him now stared, unsure of how to react. Was he going to walk away, like so many others who had been brushed off before him? Or was this visit going to be something else entirely? John, one of the youngest salespeople, couldn't help but glance nervously over at his manager, who was busy talking to a young couple near the back. He had seen the man enter, but wasn't sure what to make of him. A few seconds passed, and then, to everyone's surprise, the elderly man walked straight up to the desk where John was standing. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak to the owner." John blinked. He wasn't expecting that. Most customers who came in just wanted to look at the cars, maybe take one for a test drive. They didn't ask to speak to the owner. But there was something about the man's request that made John's heart race. He looked at the elderly man, the gray hair, the slow movements, and then the eyes. They were sharp, alert, not what you'd expect from someone who had been brushed aside just a day ago. Sir, I'm not sure if the owner is available, John stammered. But I can help you with anything you need. We've got some great models in right now. Anything you're interested in. The man didn't respond right away, simply giving a small nod. There was no urgency in his voice, no anger or frustration. Just a quiet resolve that made John feel uneasy. After a long moment, the elderly man finally spoke again. I'm here to buy the company, he said flatly. John froze, his mind trying to process the words. Excuse me? I said, I'm here to buy the company, the man repeated. The whole dealership. All of it. John blinked again, unsure whether he had heard correctly. A nervous laugh escaped his lips, but the elderly man's gaze didn't change. There was no hint of a joke, no twinkle in his eye to signal that he was playing around. He was serious. Before John could say anything else, the manager, having noticed the odd exchange, hurried over. He put on his best smile as he approached the man, eager to get him out of the way so he could focus on the more promising customers. Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you today? The manager said, his tone sweet but condescending. Looking to buy a car, perhaps? The elderly man didn't budge. No, I'm looking to buy your dealership. I want to speak to the owner. Immediately. The manager's smile faltered for a split second. He glanced over at John, who shrugged in confusion. But then, as though the man's words hadn't fazed him, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Listen, we're very busy today. If you're interested in buying a car, I can set up an appointment for you. We've got a great selection of vehicles right now. But if you're here to make any major decisions, you'll have to come back at a later time. The owner is quite busy. The elderly man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, sliding it across the desk toward the manager. The manager glanced at it, his brow furrowing as he read. It was a letter from a legal firm, detailing the steps to transfer ownership of the dealership. What is this? The manager asked, his voice suddenly unsure. That, the elderly man said, is the official paperwork. I'm not leaving until I speak to the owner. The manager stood there for a moment, processing the situation. There was something about the elderly man's presence that made the air feel thick, heavy. He didn't know who this person was, but something told him he wasn't someone to be ignored. The dealer manager hesitated. What was this? Some sort of scam? He had to get rid of this guy quickly, or things could spiral out of control. The manager straightened his back and put on his best professional face. I'm afraid you're mistaken, sir. There's no way we can process such a request without authorization from the top. I'll have to ask you to leave. But the elderly man didn't budge. I'm not going anywhere. If you don't want to speak to me, then call the owner yourself. But you'll be sorry if you don't. The tension in the room escalated as the salespeople, now more than a little curious, began to gather around the desk. The murmurs started, whispers of disbelief floating in the air. Who was this man? Why was he so confident? And what did he mean by buying the dealership? It was insane. No one had ever done such a thing. Dealerships like this were multi-million-dollar operations with deep connections in the industry. The idea that someone could walk in and simply take over the company seemed impossible. The manager turned back toward the office, his mind racing. He needed to get the owner, but he wasn't sure how to approach this. The last thing he wanted was for his boss to think he had misjudged the situation. I'll be right back, the manager said quickly, backing away. Please wait here. As he disappeared behind the office doors, the elderly man stood alone, his eyes calmly scanning the room. The tension was palpable, and yet, there was something strangely peaceful about him, like he knew something no one else did. The staff waited in silence, unsure of what would come next. The manager, meanwhile, was running through his options. But whatever was about to happen, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral in a way he couldn't control. The dealership had no idea what they had just walked into. And that was just the beginning. The manager returned a few minutes later, his face pale and his steps hurried. Behind him, the dealership's owner, Mr. Dawson, stepped into the showroom, his usually confident demeanor replaced with an air of confusion and concern. He was a tall man in his mid-50s, dressed in a sharp suit, but now his posture was rigid, almost defensive. The elderly man stood calmly at the desk, waiting for the confrontation that he knew was inevitable. Mr. Dawson wasted no time. "I hear you've been making some rather bold claims," he said, his voice more sharp than he intended, trying to maintain control of the situation. "I'm the owner of this dealership. I think it's time you explain yourself." The elderly man looked at him, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here to buy your company. Not just your dealership, but everything, your assets, your inventory, your brand. All of it." The words hung in the air, leaving the entire showroom in a stunned silence. The staff stood motionless, watching, unable to process what was happening. It was absurd. No one walked into a dealership and bought it outright. It was impossible, wasn't it? Mr. Dawson narrowed his eyes, clearly skeptical. "You've got a lot of nerve, old man. This is a multi-million-dollar business. You think you can just waltz in and—" "I'm not waltzing in, Mr. Dawson," the elderly man interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I've already made the arrangements. I've already set everything in motion. And I'm not leaving until this is done." A cold chill ran through the room. The air, thick with tension, felt as if it had been sucked out. The employees glanced at each other, some of them starting to realize that this wasn't some crazy stunt or joke. The elderly man wasn't blustering. He was serious. "Look," Mr. Dawson said, his voice growing tense, "you can't just walk in here with some paper and expect to buy the whole business. You're out of your mind. This place has been around for decades. You think you can just—" The elderly man raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't think. I know." There was a brief pause, and then the man slid a document across the desk. Mr. Dawson stared at it in disbelief.
It wasn't a letter this time.
It was the official paperwork, a legal contract, signed, sealed, and ready for transfer. The elderly man had already gone through all the necessary channels. This wasn't a prank nor a scam. It was real. "You've been operating this business for years, Mr. Dawson," the elderly man continued. "But your time is up. The terms are all laid out. I've already bought the majority of the shares in this company. You're officially out." Mr. Dawson's eyes widened as he looked at the document, his hands shaking slightly. This can't be happening."
"How?"
"How did you—" "I've been watching you for months," the elderly man said. "I've been quietly buying your shares, slowly but steadily, until I owned enough to take control. I knew exactly what I was doing. I wanted to see how you would treat your customers, your employees, your business. And what I saw didn't sit well with me." The room went completely silent. The salespeople who had once brushed the elderly man off were now staring at him, their mouths agape. The manager, his eyes wide with disbelief, looked between the two men, trying to make sense of everything. How had they not seen this coming? How had they let this man slip through the cracks when he was clearly someone with far more power than they'd ever imagined? "You thought I was just some old man who didn't matter," the elderly man continued, his voice steady. "You couldn't have been more wrong. You dismissed me, underestimated me. And now you're paying the price." Mr. Dawson looked defeated, his posture slumped. "But why?" His voice cracked. "Why would you do this? What do you want with this place?" The elderly man's eyes softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "It's not about what I want. It's about what's right. You've run this business into the ground. Your practices, the way you treat people, none of it's sustainable. This dealership could have been something more, something better. But instead, it's become just another money grab operation. I'm going to fix that." Mr. Dawson swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had no idea how to respond, how to fight back. The man in front of him had already won. His empire was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The elderly man turned and addressed the sales staff, who were still watching, completely stunned. "I hope you all understand that things are going to change around here. You'll have a new owner now. One who actually cares about his employees. One who values customers. It's time for a new chapter." As he spoke, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to John, the young salesman who had first spoken with him. "I'll be running the show now," he said. "If you want to stay, you're welcome to. But I expect things to be different here. This is your chance to make something of this dealership. I'm giving you an opportunity to be a part of something real." John stood there, his hands trembling as he took the card. He couldn't believe it. He had gone from thinking this was all a joke to suddenly finding himself in the middle of something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. But just as the elderly man turned to leave, his steps steady and resolute, a new figure appeared in the doorway. Another man, much younger, wearing a sharp suit, with a confident smile. The elderly man froze, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the newcomer. "Wait," the man said, his voice cool and confident.
There's one more thing you should know, old man.
"You think you've won? You've only just scratched the surface." The room fell silent again, the tension spiking once more. The elderly man looked at the newcomer, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, before he spoke. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low but with a certain wariness. The man smirked. "I'm the real owner." The elderly man's expression changed. He had just been handed victory on a silver platter, and now, in the blink of an eye, everything he thought he knew had been turned upside down. The real game was just beginning. The room stood still for a moment, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. The young man, wearing a crisp suit and carrying an air of authority, stepped further into the showroom, his gaze fixed on the elderly man, who was still standing by the desk, the expression on his face unreadable. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what was happening now. "Who are you?" the elderly man asked again, this time with a hint of suspicion in his voice. He had been so sure that he had won, that he had orchestrated this whole takeover. And now, in a single breath, everything had changed again. His eyes didn't leave the newcomer, but he could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. The younger man smiled faintly, a look of confidence in his eyes that only added to the mystery. "I'm the real owner of this dealership," he said, his voice cool, almost patronizing. "And I'm the one you've been trying to outbid for the past few months." The elderly man narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I own the shares. I have the paperwork. I've already taken control." The young man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not entirely. You might have bought some of the shares, but you didn't buy them all. You didn't buy the controlling stake. That's something I hold." The room seemed to close in around them. The elderly man's chest tightened. For all his careful planning, for all the months he had spent meticulously working his way into the company, it had all been for nothing. The sense of victory that had surged through him moments ago felt like it was slipping through his fingers like sand. "I don't understand," the elderly man muttered, his voice growing more strained. "I thought I had this. I thought I was done with everything. So how is it that you—" The younger man walked closer, his steps confident but slow, as though savoring the moment. "You see, I knew exactly what you were doing. I've been watching you just as closely as you've been watching this dealership. I knew you were going to try and buy us out. So I made sure to buy enough shares to keep you from ever taking control. And now, well, now I'm in charge." The elderly man stood there, the weight of the realization hitting him like a ton of bricks. He had been outplayed, outsmarted at his own game. For all his cunning and planning, he had underestimated his opponent. It was a humbling moment, one that even he couldn't ignore. But before he could respond, the young man continued, his voice softening. "You didn't lose, though. You did exactly what I wanted. You exposed how flawed the system is. You showed me just how easy it is to manipulate things when people don't pay attention. You forced me to act, to take control, to really step in and fix this mess." The elderly man blinked, his confusion growing. "You wanted me to buy your shares? You wanted me to take control?" The young man nodded, his expression serious. "I knew you had the experience, the know-how. I knew you'd figure it out. What I needed was someone who cared enough about this place to see what was wrong and fix it. Someone who had enough integrity to want to do better by the people who work here and by the customers who trust us. You proved that." A strange, almost amused smile crossed the elderly man's face as the pieces started to fall into place. It wasn't about power or money, not really. It was about the way things were run. The young man wasn't interested in just running the dealership for profit. He wanted to change it, to make it something better. "I get it now," the elderly man said softly. "You wanted to test me, to see if I was the one who could turn this place around. You used me." The young man shrugged, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Maybe. But you also showed me that you were the right person for the job. I've been working behind the scenes, but I needed someone to take the reins. Someone who understood the value of treating people right, of running a business the right way. I've watched you, and I've seen what you could do if you had the chance." The elderly man let out a slow breath, his mind processing everything. He had been outsmarted, yes, but in the end, it had worked out. He hadn't failed, after all. He had unknowingly played a part in a much bigger picture. The dealership was going to change, and now he could be a part of that change. It wasn't the victory he had imagined, but it was still a kind of triumph. The young man extended his hand, his voice steady. "You're in charge now. I'll back you up, and together, we'll make this dealership everything it should be." For a moment, the elderly man hesitated, staring at the young man's outstretched hand. But then, with a smile that was as rare as it was genuine, he reached out and shook it. And just like that, the game had shifted. The elderly man was no longer just an outsider trying to take over. He was now part of something bigger, something that would change the lives of everyone involved. The dealership, once an impersonal, money-driven business, was about to undergo a complete transformation. With the young man's insight and the elderly man's experience, they would work together to create a new culture, a new way of doing business, one that valued people over profits, integrity over shortcuts. As the staff looked on, a new sense of hope began to fill the room. They had been caught in the crossfire, uncertain of what was going to happen next. But now they could see the shift. Things were going to be different. They weren't going to be treated like pawns anymore. They weren't going to be ignored. They were part of a family, and that family was about to take this dealership to new heights. As the elderly man and the young owner walked out together, the staff felt a collective sigh of relief. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a battle of wills, of strategy, of determination. And in the end, they had all come out on top. There were no more secrets, no more hidden agendas. What mattered now was the future. And that future was bright. The story of the elderly man who was ignored by the dealership had come full circle. It wasn't about a takeover, it was about transformation. And in the end, everyone had learned that sometimes the most unexpected people can change the world for the better. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Never underestimate someone based on appearances, because you never know what kind of power lies beneath the surface.